The Tudors had a great knack for causing trouble in Ireland. With the partial exception of Henry VII, founder of the dynasty, later Tudors invariably misunderstood the country. With their strong autocratic tendencies, suspicious of the power of the various magnates in Ireland, and wanting to reduce the privileges of the corporate towns, they were never able to leave sleeping dogs lie. Throw in religious differences and contempt for Gaelic Ireland, and you have a recipe for disaster. A disaster that would go on for far longer than the Tudors themselves. The starting point for what was a tumultuous period in Irish history, running from the 1530s to the end of the 17th century, was the downfall of the Earls of Kildare. At the beginning of the period, what can be called an emerging Old English state guaranteed some stability in the country. By 1700, this Old English state had been destroyed and replaced with a more colonial one, with the Gaelic and Old English elites destroyed or exiled after numerous bloody wars, with the vast majority of the land now in the hands of Protestant newcomers, with the exception of a few native elites who anglicised themselves and changed religion, and indeed with there no longer being any such thing as Gaelic Irish or Old English. In their place were new religious-based identities. Dominant in this Old English state were the Fitzgeralds, the Earls of Kildare. For many years they had held the position of Lord Deputy, governing Ireland on behalf of the monarch in London. Their success in doing so was based on the strong web of connections they had built all over the island, with both Gaelic and Old English families, the latter seeing themselves as English born in Ireland. For example, various Fitzgerald women had married into the O'Neills of Dungannon. The grandmother and mother or stepmother of Sean O'Neill were both Fitzgerald nobles. It's important to point out that the period of Kildare hegemony was not without troubles. They had opponents, notably their long-standing rivals, the Butlers of Ormond. Moreover, as in any state, any country, any region, there were also tensions, rivalries, conflicts and arguments. Nevertheless, compared with what would come afterwards, the Earls of Kildare kept Ireland largely quiet, and most importantly, did not continually demand money from England. Under Henry VIII and Elizabeth, the situation would be the reverse. Obviously, the question arises, why did Henry VII's successor not continue his policy of ruling Ireland through the Earls of Kildare? Summarising the supposed quotation from Henry taught when I was in school, "If all Ireland cannot rule this man, let this man rule all Ireland." The answer to this requires an entire video, a very long video, or perhaps a book. It can basically be summed up as a result of arrogance, ignorance, religion, hubris, intolerance, centralisation, absolutism, greed, faction, and stupidity. While Henry VII had been willing to tolerate Kildare power in Ireland, relations between the Fitzgeralds and Henry VIII were more fractious. In part, this was due to conflicts in Ireland. In the 1520s, the Earl of Desmond was creating trouble, if not treason, in Munster, dealing with the King of France and with Charles V. Rivalries between Ormond and Kildare also created enormous tensions. More especially, Henry VIII could not seem to tolerate the idea of powerful magnates in Ireland and, like his successors, was unable to understand how Ireland worked. There was always some tension, some conflict between lords in Ireland. It took great skill, based on an understanding of Gaelic and Gaelicised Ireland, to govern the country. From Henry VIII onwards, English monarchs were more obsessed with curbing the power of what they saw as overmighty lords than building a state which could govern the country and integrate the native elites. Religion made things worse. As is well known, in the early 1530s, Henry VIII broke with Rome, and in 1534 he had himself made the supreme head of the Church of England by Parliament with the passing of the Act of Supremacy. 2 years later, the Irish Parliament passed a similar Act of Supremacy, but by this time the political scene had changed dramatically. Henry's power grab and his disposal of Protestantism created many problems for him, not least making enemies of the Empire and the Papacy, and creating popular unrest in his own dominions. In the north of England, this resulted in the Pilgrimage of Grace. In Ireland, it created an unending series of problems. More immediately, the religious question aggravated tensions in Ireland. Garrett Og, as the 9th Earl of Kildare was known, had been doing his best to act as Lord Deputy, coping with faction fighting in England and Ireland, religious tensions, court plotting, and the hostility of Henry and his officials to what they saw as overmighty subjects. In a way, Garrett Og was in a hopeless position, as he was continually undercut by the faction fighting in London. He was summoned to London on a number of occasions, lost his position as Lord Deputy to Piers Butler and later to William Skeffington, arrested in England, allowed return to Ireland, and in July 1532 made Lord Deputy again for the final time. And at the end of that year, he was badly injured by a gunshot while besieging Birr Castle. Things then began to deteriorate. In England, Thomas Cromwell was gathering information against Garrett Og and putting opponents of the latter into positions in the Dublin government. Henry VIII summoned him to London again. Sick, Garrett Og sent his wife, arguing he was not fit enough to go. However, Henry insisted that he had to go to England. In 1534, Garrett Og held his last council meeting, where he appointed his son Thomas, Lord Offaly, often called Silken Thomas, as his deputy while he was absent. In London, when he arrived there, it must have seemed obvious that Garrett Og was very ill, if not dying. Arrangements were set in place to send Skeffington back to Ireland, but without a strong force. Silken Thomas was ordered to convene a council meeting in Dublin, and instructions were sent to the Crown's men on this council. Garrett Og, however, wrote to his son, warning him not to trust the council, and telling him that they intended to send him to England, where his life would be in danger. Silken Thomas instead turned up at the council, guarded by what Ellis calls a retinue of horsemen. He resigned his position and condemned the king's policies. Although this may have been intended as a minor act to force Henry's hand, it triggered the imprisonment of his father in the Tower of London. Henry was treating it as an act of rebellion. As Ellis points out, this occurred while Thomas Cromwell was ensuring that the Act of Supremacy would be passed by Parliament, thereby turning the Papacy and the Empire against England. Indeed, the Pope would eventually excommunicate the king. This meant the reaction to even a minor rebellion would be severe. In turn, Henry's reaction pushed Thomas further along the path of armed rebellion. In July, Silken Thomas entered Dublin with a large military force, including a number of cannon. He besieged but failed to capture Dublin Castle. However, Archbishop Allen, one of Henry's key men on the council, was murdered by Thomas's supporters as he tried to escape from the castle. Although Silken Thomas's revolt tends to be brushed over in the historiography, it was very serious. Silken Thomas denounced Henry as a heretic, adding a religious element to his rebellion and attracting attention from Europe, notably from Charles V. According to Mary Ann Lyons, the latter promised to send him men the following year, thereby pushing Silken Thomas into a much different type of rebellion. Silken Thomas could draw on a large force and was able to exert control over much of the Pale. He also received some support from the Earl of Desmond, McCarthy, Moore and O'Brien. Indeed, apart from Dublin, only the cities of Waterford and Kilkenny, dominated by the Butlers, opposed him. In September, Gearóid Óg died, meaning that Silken Thomas became the 10th Earl of Kildare. According to some sources, he had 15,000 men. However, he failed to capitalise on his strength, in part because his force was divided among various locations. Although he besieged Dublin again, once again he failed to take it. In October, Skeffington returned to Ireland with 2,300 men. He also had a number of pieces of artillery, soon to make an impact. This was a very large force for the time. According to Ellis, it was the largest force sent by the English to Ireland since Richard II's 1399 expedition. Silken Thomas opted for a traditional defensive strategy, avoiding large-scale battles. Although he had numerical superiority, he may have believed that the weather, sickness and desertion would weaken the English force. Indeed, Skeffington himself fell sick for a while. And there was also a truce between the two forces from the 19th of December 1534 to the 6th of January 1535. However, it was Thomas's forces that were weakened. Many of his supporters in the Pale were lukewarm at best. His defensive policy, and especially his pulling back to Maynooth, allowed many in the Pale to change sides. Among those that did were two of his uncles. One report from December said that Thomas only had a few hundred men. However, this was probably his field force, since most of his soldiers would have been garrison troops in Maynooth, Trim and Carlow, and various other castles. There was some raiding and counter-raiding taking place, and some castles, such as Kildare, changed hands, sometimes on more than one occasion. However, Silken Thomas had committed the grave military sin of ceding initiative to Skeffington. He appears to have been in Connaught seeking to raise troops when Skeffington marched against Maynooth. Although he moved back east, the castle had fallen before he could reach it. Presumably, he believed that the castle was so strong that it could withstand a siege for a considerable period. However, as would happen elsewhere in Ireland in the 16th and 17th centuries, the power of artillery against castles would rapidly be shown. The Maynooth garrison was probably around 100 men, many of whom were gunners. It was commanded by Christopher Parisi, or Paris, said by some sources to be Thomas's foster brother. However, this is unclear. His men were facing a large army, up to 2,000 strong, with a strong artillery. It would prove to be an unequal task. Skeffington's force began its bombardment on the 13th of March. This went on for some days. After around 10 days, a breach was made in the walls. Skeffington's men assaulted this and quickly took the external fortifications. The garrison would have been unable to oppose them, as they were so heavily outnumbered. Between 50 and 60 of the garrison seemed to have been killed by now. The rest retreated into the main keep, still a formidable structure. While the keep was strong, the garrison had no real hope of winning the battle. They could hold out for some time, but in doing so they would die. Less than 50 of them remained. Probably they hoped for some sort of terms so they could escape with their lives. What actually happened next is not clear. Ellis says that the constable Parisi surrendered the keep after a bribe. Other sources agree with this but are more colourful. They accuse Parisi of getting his men drunk so the English could capture the keep. It's hard to know the truth of this. It's likely that Parisi did take a bribe, but he may have included the guarantee of his life and his men in this. It's impossible to know for sure. One of the reasons for this confusion is that Skeffington did not keep his word. He took the keep on the 10th day without any more fighting. A few days later, Despite any agreement that may have been made, Parisi and most of the surviving garrison were hung on the walls of the castle. This came to be labelled as the Pardon of Maynooth. The fall of Maynooth was the death knell for the rebellion. Some raids would still be carried out by Gaelic forces, but they were not particularly serious. With the fall of Maynooth, Silken Thomas had lost his home base, resulting in support for him collapsing. However, there was the question what would happen to him. He could hold out indefinitely in Ireland, taking refuge with Gaelic supporters, or even flee abroad. Eventually, Silken Thomas, now an earl and according to Ellis despairing of Spanish aid, tried to open negotiations with the government. The government were receptive and the negotiations proved to be successful. Silken Thomas was promised that his life would be spared and he could retain his estates. He then surrendered in August 1534 to Lord Grey. However, he would be sent to England in October, while Skeffington himself would die in December and be replaced as Lord Deputy by Grey. Henry was out for blood. Despite the promises made to Silken Thomas, Henry had decided to execute him and other male members of his family, including the two who had come over to the English. He was persuaded to delay this for political reasons. However, this delay was only for a year or so. In February 1537, Thomas and his 5 uncles were executed in Tyburn in London. However, Thomas's half-brother escaped the slaughter of the male Fitzgeralds. He would be smuggled abroad and eventually be restored. However, the power of the House of Kildare had been broken. Even after the earldom was restored, it did not regain its power and influence. The Fitzgeralds of Kildare survived the tumults of the 17th century by anglicising and becoming part of the Protestant ascendancy in the 18th. The siege and capture of Maynooth marks the failure of Silken Thomas's rebellion and the fall of the Earldom of Kildare. Never again would it have the power that it had at the end of the 15th, beginning of the 16th century. More importantly, the siege of Maynooth marked the beginning of a long and bloody process which resulted in the transformation of Ireland and a new historic path being laid, one which excluded the majority of the population. Thanks for watching the video. I hope you enjoyed it. Please subscribe and, if you can, support the channel by buying me a coffee. See the link below.